What is up, my friends and fellow Busybees? I hope you're all doing well and had a great week. If you're in Ontario, you had a long weekend, so I hope you enjoyed that. We got the chance to go up to Muskoka, which is where I grew up. It's like the cottage country of Ontario, and it was beautiful, great weather, nice and snowy. We were able to take the puppy, and he was able to run around off leash, which of course he loved, and all the new smells and sounds and animals and stuff. So super fun and just really nice to get away. I feel like in the middle of February, it can get a little bit like cabin feverish. We've had an okay year in terms of weather. It hasn't been super cold, and knock on wood, it hasn't been super dreary. We've had some sun, which is amazing, but it's just nice to have a change of scenery every once in a while and get away from this house that was feeling a little bit like a puppy prison for a while. So I hope you're doing good as well. And welcome back to the 101 series, where I go back to basics and talk about the products that we use in our furniture makeovers and do a bit of a deep dive into them, explaining what they are, what they're used for, a bit about how and when I like to use them, my preferred brands, and the pros and cons of them. Today's episode is all about chalk paint, and if you missed it and are curious, feel free to check out episode 33, where I talked all about mineral paint. Now, if you've had any exposure to the world of furniture painting and furniture makeovers, I'm going to assume that you have at least heard about chalk paint before. I feel like it's typically the beginner paint that is used, and it has made a pretty big name for itself, especially in certain styles of furniture and furniture refinishing. But what is chalk paint anyways? So the term chalk paint specifically was actually coined and trademarked by Sloan back in 1990, and it's known to be a versatile furniture paint, which is why it's so beginner friendly. And Sloan has said that it was specifically designed to be easy to use, quick, and reliable. It is said to rarely require any prep work on the piece before going in with paint, which is why it's so beginner friendly. Though, as you know, regardless, I always recommend not skipping the prep stage, but it is what it advertises. And it's said that it doesn't require any sanding or priming, and it can work on wood, melamine, metal, laminate, and concrete, and works on pieces that will live both indoors and outdoors. I've also heard of people painting flooring, dyeing fabric, and painting glass with chalk paint. Chalk paint is also a water-based paint, my personal favorite, which means it isn't an acrylic or latex paint, and thus it has low VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds, and there's barely any smell as a result. This means it's safe to use indoors, where you may not have great ventilation and things like that, which is always a plus. The thing that sets this type of paint apart from the others in its appearance is the very matte finish it provides compared to other paints. It has a soft, chalky appearance, hence the name, and it looks like that due to the plaster of Paris or calcium carbonate that is in the recipe of the paint. You may have also come across other additives to other types of paint that can give it a chalk-like appearance, like BB Frosh, or Frosh. I'm not sure how it's pronounced personally. And I mentioned that the term chalk paint was coined by Sloan, and if you didn't know, Sloan is a person, but also a brand and a line of chalk paint and other related products. I use them, I love them, but there's other brands of chalk paint out there. However, you'll often notice that they're called something similar but different, like chalky paint, or chalk style paint, or chalk based paint. It's a small difference, but I always find it funny seeing the different variations that they come up with for the different brands. And that's because the term chalk paint on its own is trademarked by Sloan, so only she can use it, which is like, snaps for Sloan. Like, what a great thought to have when she first created this type of paint. So to apply chalk paint, you can either use a brush, roller, or even a paint sprayer. If you are applying with a brush, it's recommended to use a natural bristle brush with long, flexible bristles to get a smooth, uniform finish. I use the Sloan chalk paint brushes. I'll link them in the show notes, and they work great for that medium. If you are rolling or spraying, I would recommend watering the paint down a bit by putting the amount you will be using into a separate container and then slowly adding in maybe a tablespoon of water at a time and mixing it up until you get a thinner consistency that will just glide a bit smoother. Even when I'm applying with a brush, I like to have a misting bottle handy to spray on either the surface I'm about to paint or the paintbrush prior to applying the paint to the piece, or sometimes both, depending how thick the paint is, and that ensures that I get a smooth glide when I apply it, since it is a thicker paint than some others you may be used to. Now, some colors are a little more pigmented than others, and it always depends what color you're covering up, but typically you only need about 2 coats of chalk paint for your pieces to get full coverage. That comes with exceptions, of course. If you have a black piece that you haven't primed first, and you want to paint it a bright white, you will likely require another couple coats, that kind of thing. And since this paint is water-based, you should always add a top coat over it to seal it in and provide more durability to your piece. Often, wax is used with chalk paint to provide that finish. And unless you're wanting to add decorative elements, then you'll likely be using a clear wax. But if you want to add in some depth and character to the piece, there's also black, brown, and other colors of wax. To apply it, I personally use another chalk paint brush from Sloan to apply my wax, but there are wax brushes specifically made for that purpose. They're just a little bit more hard bristled and really compact. And you can even apply it with a microfiber cloth or a lint-free shop rag or a shop towel. And adding that wax on will provide that velvety finish on the piece, or you can achieve a more kind of satin-looking finish if you really buff it into the piece once it has sat for a bit and you're wiping off the excess. You can also always use something like a polyurethane to add some more durability to the piece, or even to certain areas that require it, like the top of a dresser or something like that. Now, as you know, mineral paint is my preferred paint medium as of late, so I don't grab for a chalk paint super often these days. However, the lines of chalk paint that I have tried and enjoyed in the past have been, of course, Sloan chalk paint, as well as the Rust-Oleum chalked line that I get from Home Depot, the Behr chalk paint that I also get from Home Depot, and hot tip, you can get that tinted to any color you want if you bring it to their paint desk. And I also really like the folk art chalk paint that I get from my local Michaels. There are many others out there, and I'm sure they all perform similarly, so feel free to try out whatever's most accessible to you, but I'll link those in the show notes if you're interested in trying them out. The times when I do gravitate towards a chalk paint over something like a mineral paint is when I feel like the piece leans in a farmhouse style direction, because I just feel like chalk paint is a really great medium to achieve a really classic or even a rustic farmhouse look. It is also my preferred paint to distress. Since it's ultra matte, it distresses really easily with some high grit sandpaper, and it's also really forgiving in its look. If you have some spots around the edges of where you distress that got maybe worn but didn't necessarily wipe away completely, if that makes sense. There's other techniques that you can use to distress, like wet distressing also, but I'm just the kind of person that I stick with what I know if it's been working for me, so I just opt for my sandpaper. It is also a great medium to choose if you want to achieve a textured look of any kind on your piece. There are some furniture artists out there who exclusively use chalk paint because they do all of these super cool techniques creating layers of texture in different areas, and those amazing ombre dressers that you may have seen are also likely painted in chalk paint just because you can blend it together super easily and use your misting bottle to your advantage to create the most seamless effect. Also worth noting is that you can absolutely mix up custom colors of chalk paint, just like any other paint really, to create your own bespoke, unique colors if you can't find one that fits the vision that you have in your head. I also like to provide both sides of the coin, so I also want to talk about some things that may be considered cons when choosing chalk paint, depending on the piece that you're working on and depending on your situation. Like I said, since it is an ultra matte finish and can be a thicker texture and consistency, I wouldn't recommend choosing it if you're looking to achieve a super sleek, modern satin finish. There's just other products out there that will help get you there quicker and easier, in my opinion. Like I also mentioned, it requires a protective top coat in order to provide the durability that you'll need, so that is some added time, money, and effort in your project. Other paints like Fusion Mineral Paint, for example, have built-in top coats, so they don't necessarily require that added protection on the whole piece. I recommend adding one for sure on high traffic areas, but things like the side of a dresser might not require it. I do find that wax as a top coat, though it is the finish most often chosen, also tends to take quite a while to fully cure and can end up having imperfections in it during that time, easier than something like a poly would once it was dry to the touch, but not yet fully cured. And with wax, you will also likely need to put another layer on after a while, say a year or two, to keep it staying durable for you, so take that into account. Now, when painting with chalk paint, it's easier to end up with brushstrokes in the finish if you aren't being careful, so I think it's important to say that, especially if you're a beginner and doing your first furniture flip and using chalk paint and you see that, so you don't get discouraged. A way to mitigate that, like I mentioned, is watering the paint down slightly or using water intermittently on the piece to make the paint go on less gloopy when it's being applied. If you don't notice the brushstrokes until the layer of paint has dried, you can also just go in with a high grit sandpaper once it's fully dried. I'd say maybe 220 grit or higher, and lightly sand the paint to remove any of those brushstrokes in the finish. Then wipe away any dust it may have created and then go in with your next layer of paint. At the same time, chalk paint is a really beginner-friendly paint to try out overall. If you're getting huge tins of it, it can be more expensive than other types of paint, but if you get a smaller container just to try it out on a small project like a side table or something like that, it can be a really great, easy way to try out your first furniture flip, and it's a project you can easily do indoors without needing very many materials. As always, if you have any questions from today, if there's something I didn't cover, or if you have suggestions for more episodes in the 101 series where we go back to basics, send me an email or hit up my DMs on Instagram at MelDidItHerself, and I'll be sure to add them to my list. Special shout out to Jen, who reached out and let me know she wanted one on paint strippers. It's coming for you soon, Jen. Stay tuned. And something you may not know about me, I love little motivational messages. They always get me fired up, and I keep a running list of ones that are especially catchy or speak to me in the Notes app on my phone. So I end every podcast episode with one of those that I've noted down over the years in hopes that you leave our time here each week feeling inspired, motivated, and ready to take on whatever comes your way this week. So this week's Mel's motivational message is from a series of books that I've been reading recently by Ryan Holiday, and the book is called The Obstacle is the Way. There's a 3-part series. It's really good if you're into kind of existential self-help kind of books. I find it interesting. So this week's Mel's motivational message is, passing one obstacle simply says you're worthy of more. So remember that if you're trying out these different paint mediums or you're trying out a new product on your furniture makeover and you run into a glitch or you come across something that you didn't realize, it's a repair that you've never done, or you're faced with a challenge that you haven't seen in the past, just take a step back, take the time to either reach out to somebody, do some research, or just do some trial and error, the good old-fashioned way, and figure out how you can surpass that obstacle, because once you can do that, it just validates to yourself that you're worthy of more, that you're able to take on more challenges, and you can take that knowledge that you've learned and bring that with you as you move forward. The book itself, The Obstacle is the Way, is just that. It talks about how, we're trying to figure out our journeys and we're trying to see where we're going, and we hit these obstacles and we see them as barriers, and they can slow us down or they can discourage us, but ultimately the obstacle is the way. That's the only way forward. That's the only way you're going to validate to yourself that you can do this, that you're capable, that you're worthy of more, and that you can take on more obstacles in the future. So don't shy away from them. If you come across them, take a step back, strategize, figure out a way that you can tackle it, and don't be worried about trying to access resources to do that, whether that might be reaching out to a fellow refinishing friend. Maybe you do some Googling, maybe you watch some YouTube, maybe you read some books. Don't look at that as wasted time or you're looking for the easy way out versus just trying to do some trial and error. However you get there, ultimately all we're trying to do is get past that obstacle and show ourselves that we're able to do that and that we can move forward and take on more challenges, and the more that we do, the easier it will get. So remember that as you move forward this week with any challenge, any barrier, any obstacle you face, passing that obstacle simply says that you're worthy of more, and I know you're worthy of more, my friend. All right, that's it for now. I appreciate your time, and I'll catch you guys next week.